Hi, I'm Paul. I'm a lead consultant with Equal Experts. And in this video, I'm going to show you how I've been using AI to support threat modeling, which helps me build more secure systems faster. Now, if you're watching this video, I'm going to assume that you know what AI, artificial intelligence, Gen AI, is all about. I'm going to quickly recap what threat modeling is, though. Now, I'm going to take words from the UK's National Cyber Security Centre to help describe it. It's a set of techniques that are used to model and analyze technology systems, services to better understand how that system or service might be attacked or otherwise fail. So it's about looking at a system from a particular perspective, the attacker's perspective, the failure modes, and then prioritizing those and looking at measures or controls to manage the risk posed by those attacks or failings. The second part of the NCSC's guidance on this topic is where they talk about how best to apply these techniques, when it's best to apply them. So they recommend that threat modeling is used to inform the development and design of any technology system or service, and it is incorporated into a risk management process, development, or CI/CD systems. That's where we can run into problems. Now, every infosec team I've worked with, for the last 10 years at least, has advocated for threat modeling. And there's always been a common problem. Threat modeling is actually quite hard to do. OWASP is an open security organization, and they produce this threat modeling process document. There are many other documents like it. You can see that the process is not entirely straightforward. There's a series of steps you need to go through, and within those steps, there's a lot of new terms that have very specific meanings within threat modeling, things like assets, trust levels, data flow diagrams. You need to understand what these terms mean to be able to collect together the information that you need to do the threat modeling. Down here, we've got STRIDE, a specific style of threat modeling. It's one that's really common, I found, with infosec teams. And going into the detail, you can see there's lots and lots of detail here. So as well as trying to do the threat modeling, I also have to maintain kind of awareness of the meta problem of where we are in the process. What's the next steps? Are we doing this correctly? I see, there's just a lot of things to do. There's a constant challenge of, am I capturing enough detail? Too little? Am I focusing on some areas too much, other areas not enough, other areas I've missed completely? How do I balance these things as I'm going through? What typically tends to happen for me is more and more detail gets thrown into the document before I or we, the team, is finished on the first pass. We give up because the document is already so long that it just seems overwhelming and useless. So can we use Gen AI tooling that many of us will have available already, chat windows that you type prompts into, to address some of these challenges, to lessen the load of that process, the complexities of it, the idiosyncrasies, helping a team, particularly a new team, get started and get moving with the process, helping them stay on track, manage the detail, manage the scope, keep all the notes, draw the diagrams, and inject a little infosec expertise that's not already in the team. So let me share with you a prompt that I've been using that meets many of the goals for me that I talked about a moment ago. I'll quickly highlight what I think are important elements of the prompts that I've currently got, and then we'll go through an example. Everything in here is the result of things that didn't work so well that I've prompted to address those deficiencies and ended up here. So telling it to be my coach, telling it to guide me through the process, to stop it from running ahead and doing lots and lots of work on its own that I've then got to review. I want to work step by step, small pieces. I want the coach to keep the threat model as simple and focused as possible, keep me on track. A little bit about the threat analysis framework that I want to use. I've chosen STRIDE. The threat modeling process, I've given it a specific series of steps to walk through with things that need to be covered in each step. So scoping and context with some specifics. System modeling, asset identification, this is where the data flow diagram gets produced. Threat elicitation, let's start going through the threats and trying to figure out where the risks are. And mitigation planning, go through the threats looking for mitigations. Finally, go back through everything and let's produce the final kind of document that we're going to use as the threat model. And at each stage, there's specific prompting in there to stop, present to me what we've got right now in this section, give me an opportunity to back and forth to kind of refine and tweak that before moving on to the next section, so that I'm not reviewing a document for the first time when we get to phase 5. And here's the same prompt in a Gemini Gem, which is how I'm currently using this. You can see the prompt in here in instructions, so I'm just going to get started. If I had elaborate documentation for a system, decision records, architecture diagrams, readmes, etc., I could upload those at this point, and that would get things moving quickly and provide some of the answers to the questions that are going to come. For this session, I thought I'd keep it really generic. I'm going to put in a prompt. The system is a to-do application with a database backend server and web front end. Begin session. We'll see how we get on. Okay, so the system came straight back with a bunch of really relevant questions for scoping and system context. What's the core functionality? So I've said users can create, update, delete their own tasks, and they can share with others to make it a little bit more interesting. It asked me whether the cloud infrastructure and CI/CD deployment process are in scope or out of scope. So I'm going to push the CI/CD deployment pipeline out of scope, but I'm going to keep the cloud infrastructure in scope, and I'm going to say it's on AWS. Who are the users of the system? So we'll just consider standard authenticated user, but it does suggest that other roles like administrators, which is useful input. I might not have thought about that. I hadn't thought about it in this case. Does the application handle any sensitive data? The content of a to-do item contains PII. Well, yes, it might. The systems come back with asking for a little bit of information about which specific AWS services are going to be used to host these components, and with a specific user story, which you can see it's going to be using that user story to figure out what the data flow is. There's my response. Backend code running on Lambda. We're going to use RDS for a database, running PostgreSQL, and we don't need file storage. We're not worried about images or anything like that. Solid foundation for our session. So there we go. So we're already at the point where we can start drafting the introduction section of the report. So this is specific prompting. I've got delivered as pre-formatted text or enclosed in Markdown. So here's my response. Pre-formatted text, use pre-formatted for these interim steps. And just present me with a Markdown code block option at the end. Okay, so here we go. This is the introductory section. So we've got to-do app, system purpose, outlines the threat model, primary purpose, create, retrieve, update, delete operations on the personal tasks, core feature, the ability for a user to share a specific task with another registered user. The system is designed to handle PII, both in user profiles and potentially within the context of tasks. In domain-driven design terms, the task system resides within the task management bounded context. Okay. Scope, things we've got in scope, things we've got out of scope, security of the user's end device, good point. AWS account level security, again, a good point. Our organization-wide IAM policies, SCPs, that kind of thing, easily missed, but they are a factor, just potentially not under the control of the team that's doing the work. CI/CD pipeline, again, just calling these things out of scope, I think is really useful because we could later draw them into scope or do a separate threat model to look at those threats, those aspects introduced. Primary user story, great. Got some actors in here. I think we covered quite a lot of ground, and every time I do this, it's quite a similar process. It varies based on the system we're dealing with, but it's similar enough, and I get to this point quite quickly. So let's say approve and move on to phase 2. So now we've got a data flow diagram. At this point, I take the data flow diagram and load it into a separate tab to take a look at the Markdown document that's coming out. There are some syntactic problems with the brackets, so I'll sort those out. So it's quoted those values now, so that's working. So I might go back to the prompt and try to avoid having that problem in the future. Not a big deal. Now, the diagram that's coming out here looks like this. So for me, that diagram looks a bit too high level. Let's prompt to include more details about the data and credentials. So obviously, it's in order to bring those details out, it's introduced new components like API Gateway, AWS Secrets Manager, etc. Now, when I do this normally against a system that exists already or one that's better specified, those sorts of details are available. I can tell it up front that we're going to use this service, that service. This is a very high-level example, but you can see those choices don't look unreasonable. So obviously, the diagram that's produced is probably a lot less detailed than the one I would produce, but much more focused on the goals of a threat modeling exercise. So yeah, I'm going to say that's fine now. Let's move on. Components, critical assets, and then we're ready to move on to threat elicitation. So quick time check. At this point, I've been working on this for about 20-25 minutes. We're on to phase 3, threat elicitation. Let's look at the fun bit. How might we attack this system? Can you give me something that I can review instead of starting to write lots of words myself? Threat number 1. Attacker steals a valid JWT, can replay it to the API gateway, allows them to impersonate a legitimate user and perform actions on their behalf. Impact and likelihood. So here we go. It's suggesting maybe the impact is high and likelihood is medium. Agree. The system's going to guide me through the other stride categories, so we'll fast forward through this. We've just looked at spoofing, and we've got T for tampering, R for repudiation, I for information disclosure, D for denial of service, and lastly, E for elevation of privilege, and we will pick up here. We've been through, in the space of about 35 minutes, we've been through several stages, 3 phases of the threat modeling process. We've identified 4 threats. I do feel some of those could easily have been missed during development work on a real system or initial elaboration work. Getting them highlighted this early could really speed up implementation. And obviously, if there was a risk they could have been missed altogether all the way through into production, then we've caught those things before any harm can be done. I'm going to show you one more thing here. So it's asking me if there's any other threats or weaknesses that we haven't covered yet. So I'm going to suggest vulnerabilities in a software package that we're using, and let's see what it says. Easy to inject my own thoughts and opinions into the threat model. The other point to call out here is that we could adjust the prompt so that the threat modeling process always considers supply chain risks as part of the threat modeling process. So as we discover important aspects that are sometimes missed, we can refine the prompting to ensure they're not missed in future. Although there's probably a balance there. Again, at this stage, it might be a little early to have lots and lots and lots of threats being identified. But prompts can be tweaked. So we got third-party dependencies. So yes, I think that. So here's the threat table, and it's ready when the system's prompting me to move on. Instead of that, I've asked, what about a compromised CI/CD system? That seems like quite an important threat, and it certainly is. And you'll remember that we said during the scoping phase it was out of scope, and the system has reminded me of that. We explicitly defined this as out of scope. Do you want to stick to that scope, or do you want to change the scope? Good point. I'm going to stick to the scope. Stick to scope and move on. So the first mitigation, we're dealing with the critical risk item first. Great. That's the right way to do it, I would say. So threat number 1. It's personally vice. Yes, shortly that's yes, that makes sense. Store token secure on the client. Yes, that makes sense. Say HTTP only local storage. HTTP only and avoid local storage. Avoid local storage. Well, I should look at local storage. I need to understand why that would be the case. Like, what matters is getting a threat model put together, thinking about the things I might not have thought about as a developer, as an engineer, like when I'm focused on one part of the system, missing something somewhere else. Just going through this process, being challenged constantly to understand some of the wider consequences, to have a perspective presented to me that's not my own and isn't the perspective of somebody else in my team who may also be subject to the same biases that I am. I feel like I'm getting a much broader sort of cross-section of potential areas of concern. Anyway, threat number 2, insufficient audit trail, detailed application log. And I think there was one more threat to look at, threat number 5, which was the supply chain risk. Vendor bot, snake, etc., to look for vulnerabilities. Vulnerability scanning, patch management process, yeah. I mean, really good, like really solid, foundational, really good. Now we have our mitigations. That's phase 4 done. Now we're into phase 5. This is easy, but we just need to review. So here's the introduction again. There may be changes here based on what happened in the rest of the threat modeling session. It might not be quite the same as the initial one that I reviewed a little while ago. That's part of the advantage. So the AI assistant can go back and make edits to this if we learned that something changed during the course of the threat modeling exercise. So it does need to be reviewed again. Obviously, like, I'm happy with it. So I'm going to say, yeah, approve. Again, that introductory session is not overwhelming. So I can quickly kind of like look through that, read it through in detail. It's not a huge document to review. System architecture. System context, data flow diagram. Sorry, data flow diagrams here, same data flow diagram as before. The components, the critical assets, and yes, I'm going to approve that as well. Threat analysis is my table with information about the threats and mitigations. Yeah, just look through that in some detail. That's fine. Yes, I give my approval. And yes, I approve the accepted risks that there are none. Okay, so it did not prompt me again. It gave me pre-formatted report sections, and now it's prompting me whether I want a markdown code block for the final thing. I am going to get a markdown code block so that I can put it into that repo that I showed you earlier. There we go. Do wait until it's actually finished writing before we try and paste it out. Oh, and unfortunately, I have got a bit of a formatting problem. Every time we switch to like a code block within the code block, we then drop back out to pre-formatted text. I've not found a good way of really dealing with that so that it does, so it's foolproof. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that down to here and then get it. Okay, I'm going to say, and then I can just tell it got this far, so I can ask it to repeat the report from 2.2 in the markdown code block. Right, and there we go. That's the rest of it. So, and here we have it, the final threat model in markdown formats on the GitHub repo. So you remember, you've got the system purpose, mentioned the task management bounded context, in scope, out of scope, primary user story, system architecture, this is the data flow diagram, components, critical assets, and the threats and mitigations. Accepted risks, and that's the threat model. I've certainly seen threat models where that's it. You get the table, you get the bits at the beginning. What I've tended to do with this is to just try and capture more of that conversation because it's so easy to do. So what I will typically do is stick a prompt like this on the end of the threat modeling session to summarize threats and mitigations from the table in an appendix and include details of the conversations. And I will get stuff that looks like this. And I feel like that's a really useful addition. The table is you don't want to try and put too much in there because it just becomes unusable. But an appendix going row by row through the table and providing all that detail in a more long form style, I feel that's a really useful addition to the threat model. I know what you're thinking, all very well and good, but what happens now? We've got a threat model, so what? Well, this is a process you can just repeat. So if you take the threat model with the detail that got captured in the appendix as useful, drop that into a new chat with the threat modeling coach like this, give it a prompt for what you want to do. In this case, I just said, can we look for a new high-risk threat we didn't cover and start the session there? It came back with, what does the API return if user B is not a valid user? Okay, fair. We're going to need to handle that. And it's an opportunity for information disclosure. So this is certainly useful. I could also guide it into a specific area. I might want to look at encryption in motion, encryption at rest. We should probably be using modern cipher suites everywhere, making sure that threat's included. Or lastly, if I'm looking at a new feature, I want to have these to-dos, I want to make them so that we can share them publicly. What new threats might that expose me to? What new mitigations might I need in place? So I feel there's lots of potential benefit going forward in terms of sustaining the process as well, making it easy to jump back into threat modeling at any point and extend the threat model or split out a new one. Again, I could start from here and create a new threat model for the CI/CD process, making sure that that is secure enough and we've mitigated any threats we should there. The chat transcript that happened as you were interacting with the threat modeling coach, this is available to you. It goes back here. This is back on the original chat that I had. This goes back and back, recorded until retention policies delete this chat information from Gemini. So I can scroll back and debug the process, the conversation. I can keep notes as I go as well. That's what I tend to do. And just keep refining and iterating the prompts. What went wrong? What could have gone better? What did I kind of waste time repeating to myself? And this could be a really interesting conversation to have with an infosec person in the room as well. And there we go. A very rushed threat modeling session against a very vaguely specified system, heavily compressed and edited down so it doesn't waste an hour of your time. I hope you found that useful as an example of like how I'm using the technology, not just a prompt. You can get the prompt from the GitHub repo that I'm using today, and I'm happy to take discussions, PRs, issues on there if you want to share what you've done with threat modeling based on my prompt or some other way. If you want to try this with other LLMs, I'm focused mostly on Gemini because that's what I'm using as my day-to-day driver. But if you try it with another kind of model, I'd love to know how that goes. Hopefully you saw how I focused on keeping moving, getting to the end of the threat model. I can think of things that the threat model didn't include, but that's okay, because trying to produce a perfect threat model first time round is an anti-pattern. This is not a good idea. You won't finish. I've used it with teams on threat modeling large systems, different kinds of systems. I've worked on, I've modeled Databricks running at AWS with classic compute to understand what sort of threats there might be at the seams of that kind of system. I've used it to model my development process, my CI/CD process for my personal projects. I've used it to help me build secure Docker images and deployment pipelines for those. And I've used it to understand the kind of threats that might exist when I install an AI agent on my computer. Yeah. And if you're an infosec professional, maybe this technology finally lets you scale your expertise to the teams that need it and can help everybody build more secure systems. Thanks for your time.